Welcome to the Test Management Mindset, insights into the world of software testing. The best content by Practitest in audio form, designed to keep you inspired wherever you are. In today's episode, we're on the topic of the testing tax. The hidden price financial institutions are paying for their outdated QA practices. That's costing more than just time. Discover how the testing tax is slowing teams down and how to fix it. Let's get started.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know, we always love digging into the stuff you send our way, and this time we've got a really interesting pile about quality assurance, specifically in financial services.
Yeah, always a fascinating area.
Absolutely. So what we want to do today is sort of pull out the most important insights from everything you've all shared with us. Like, what are the really big, fundamental challenges that banks and other financial institutions are facing when it comes to testing their systems? And then, just as importantly, how are the really smart companies, the leaders, tackling these issues in new and effective ways?
Right. I think, as I was going through everything you sent over, one thing that really jumped out at me was just how much pressure these financial institutions are under these days. You know, they're all going through these massive digital transformations, which, obviously makes their systems way more complex.
Yeah, for sure.
And at the same time, the teams that are responsible for making sure that everything works perfectly, they're often being asked to do more with maybe not always, more resources.
Okay, so complexity is definitely up. And it sounds like resources are a little bit stretched, to say the least.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the kind of phrases that I kept seeing over and over again in this material was this idea of a testing tax. And that sounds a little ominous, like we're not talking about just a minor inconvenience here.
Yeah.
So can you break that down for us? Like, what exactly does that entail? What is the testing tax?
Yeah, I think testing tax is actually a really good way to think about it. It's basically the extra burden. You could even think of it as a penalty in terms of wasted time, budgets that get blown way out of proportion, and, just the potential for things to go really wrong.
Right.
And, QA teams, particularly in financial services, are carrying all this extra weight because they're still stuck using, some of the older, less efficient testing methods.
Right.
And it's kind of, I don't know, it's like trying to race in a modern Formula One race. But you're driving a car from the 80s,
Yeah.
You're just not going to be competitive, and you're going to be spending way more money than you need to just to keep the thing running.
Yeah. And it's not even just about that initial, upfront investment in QA. It's, like you said, it's the ongoing drain of doing things the hard way. And the numbers from what you sent over are pretty startling. 31% of the entire IT budget in financial services goes to QA and testing.
Wow.
According to Capgemini's 2023-2024 World Quality Report.
Yeah.
And that's the highest of any industry. So you would think, okay, if we're throwing that much money at it, quality wouldn't be this constant problem.
Yeah, no kidding. That number, that 31%, just makes you kind of step back and ask yourself, why? Why are they spending so much, but still having these struggles, having these issues? And that same report, the World Quality Report, they talk about this thing called the digital transformation testing paradox.
Okay.
Which is basically 65% of financial services firms are saying that making sure everything works seamlessly from beginning to end across all these, increasingly complex digital systems, that's their biggest challenge.
Wow.
And so it's not just about throwing more money at the problem, right?
Right.
It's more about how you're spending that money, where you're focusing those resources.
Oh, so we're putting in the resources.
Yeah.
But we're not necessarily seeing the payoff, the return in terms of systems that just work really well all the time consistently. So what's causing this? What is it about the financial world specifically that is creating this kind of pressure cooker environment for QA teams?
I think a lot of it has to do with just the sheer interconnectedness of everything these days.
Wow.
The Gartner Banking Digital Transformation Survey from last year, it highlighted that something like 72% of banking applications have to be able to talk to not just, the latest cutting edge technology, but also these older legacy systems,
Right.
which can be, they can be pretty intricate and complicated. And so you can imagine, right? It's kind of like you're trying to get two completely different generations of computers to talk to each other perfectly every single time.
Yeah.
And that's a massive undertaking from a testing perspective.
Oh, yeah. Getting those old and new systems to play nicely together, like you said, that must create a million different edge cases. And we haven't even talked about like the regulatory environment in finance, which is, I mean, that's got to be a whole other level.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the compliance burden in finance is just, it's enormous, right?
Right.
Forrester Research, they said that financial institutions are facing like 300% more compliance-related tests than companies in any other sector.
Wow, 300%.
Yeah, like think about that for a second, right? 3 times the amount of testing, just from a regulatory perspective.
Wow.
So yeah, that puts a huge strain on resources, it pushes timelines out, and it makes you think, like, is that higher number just because there are more regulations, or is it also because proving compliance in finance is just inherently more complex? It's probably a bit of both.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not just more rules. It's probably also like more complicated ways of showing that you're actually following those rules.
Right.
And all of that complexity and like the oversight has got to have a real impact on how long these projects actually take, right?
Exactly. Yeah. The KPMG Digital Banking Report said that testing can eat up like 25 to 40% of the total project timeline for these digital transformation initiatives.
Wow.
So yeah, you've got all these systems that have to work together. You've got all these rigorous compliance checks, and that translates directly into longer development cycles and potentially slower innovation.
Right. Okay. So we've got rising complexity, heavy regulations, and significant time pressures. Now, I want to kind of dig into what your sources call the hidden costs, right?
Yeah.
We know the QA budgets are huge, but what are some of the other less obvious ways that these outdated testing practices are costing financial institutions money, time, resources?
I think one of the biggest drains is just the sheer amount of time that QA analysts have to spend on, like, tasks that aren't actual testing.
Yeah.
The Standish Group, their IT project survey from 2023, they found that the average QA analyst is spending like 12 to 15 hours every week just creating and managing test documents.
12 to 15.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically 2 full work days
Wow.
where they're not actually, doing the work of finding bugs, finding and fixing problems. So you have to ask yourself, like, why? Why is it so time consuming? Is it, a lack of the right tools, or the processes just too bureaucratic? There's got to be a better way.
Yeah, that's a lot of paperwork.
Yeah.
And you could definitely see how that would pull people away from the actual testing. And then what about, the risks that come with not testing properly, especially in such a heavily regulated industry? I mean, what are the consequences there?
Oh, the financial consequences can be really serious. The Thomson Reuters Regulatory Intelligence Report, they said that in 2023, banks had to pay an average of $14.7 million in regulatory fines.
14.7 million.
Yeah, and in 38% of those cases, they identified poor testing as a major contributing factor.
Wow.
So, that's a huge hit, not just to their bottom line, but also to their reputation and their customers' trust.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes you wonder, in those cases, was it just not enough testing? Or were they maybe, testing the wrong things, focusing on things that weren't really that important?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's not just about avoiding those penalties, right?
Yeah.
In this digital world where everything is moving so fast, the ability to be agile, to put out new features quickly, that's super important.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Agility is key.
Yeah.
But the World Quality Report that we keep talking about, they found that 59% of financial institutions said that testing was the main thing slowing them down, the main bottleneck,
Really?
preventing them from putting out updates and new services faster. So those outdated testing practices, they're costing these companies money directly, and they're also preventing them from innovating, keeping up with the competition.
Right. Okay. So we've definitely painted a pretty clear picture here. There are some major challenges and some really significant hidden costs.
Yeah.
But the good news, and I think this is where it gets really interesting, is that your sources also highlight this trend, where some of the leading financial institutions are starting to change how they do things. They're finding new ways to approach QA that are actually working.
Yeah. This is where it gets really exciting, I think, because we're starting to see some really innovative solutions emerge. You've got McKinsey, Deloitte, a bunch of others. They've all identified these kind of key dimensions that really characterize these more modern and more effective approaches to testing. And it's not just about doing the same things a little bit better, right? It's often about rethinking the entire testing process.
Okay. And you said dimensions, so let's break those down one by one. What's the first kind of key area where these companies are changing things up?
Sure. So the first one is what a lot of people are calling centralized test management.
Okay. And what does that look like in practice?
So instead of having all your test plans and cases and all the results scattered across, different systems, different spreadsheets, which can get really messy really quickly,
Right.
the leading banks, they're implementing these unified test management platforms. And you can think of them kind of like a central command center, right, where they can directly link things like regulatory requirements to specific test cases. They can automatically generate all that documentation they need for audits.
Mm-hmm.
And they get like real-time visibility into how the testing is progressing.
Okay, so it brings order to chaos.
Exactly. Yeah, much more organized.
Okay, so it sounds great in theory, but do we have any evidence that this actually leads to measurable improvements?
Oh, yeah, definitely. A Deloitte survey, they found that banks that have moved to these centralized test repositories, they're getting things done way faster.
Okay.
Like 42% faster turnaround for audit preparations.
Wow, 42%.
Yeah. I mean, think about the resources that frees up.
Yeah.
And they also saw like a 36% improvement in their ability to spot gaps in their testing.
Okay.
So when everything's in one place, it's much easier to see what's been tested, what hasn't, and where the potential risks might be hiding.
Makes perfect sense. It's like, you clean up your house, where everything is, things run smoother.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So, centralized test management. That's number one. What's the second key dimension?
All right. So the second one is what they call requirement-driven testing architecture.
Requirement-driven testing architecture. Okay.
Yeah.
And what's the big idea there?
The core principle is making sure that every single test case that you create is directly tied to a specific business need or regulatory requirement.
Okay.
So it's about moving away from this kind of ad hoc way of testing where you're just kind of testing whatever comes to mind and really focusing on things that actually matter.
Right.
From a business perspective or a compliance perspective.
So basically every test has a clear purpose, a reason for existing.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like we're not testing just for the sake of testing, We're
Right.
testing to prove that we're meeting the specific requirement, we're addressing this particular risk, whatever it might be.
Okay. And are we seeing positive results from this more focused approach?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The ISTQB, their financial services report, they said that this way of doing things, this focused testing, can reduce redundant testing by like 28%.
28%.
Yeah. So you're eliminating tests that aren't actually adding value.
Right.
And they also found that this approach led to like a 43% increase in the number of issues that were caught before the software was even released.
Wow. 43% more issues caught.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a big win, right?
Yeah.
In terms of both efficiency and just preventing problems before they become real problems.
Okay. So really focus your testing energy where it matters most.
Mm.
Love it. All right. What's the third area?
The third one is intelligent test automation.
Intelligent test automation.
All right.
Okay. So test automation, that's not a new concept, but the intelligent part, that sounds like it's taken things to another level.
Right. Yeah. Basic automation where you're just
Mhm.
kind of, automating the execution of these repetitive test scripts. I mean, that's been around for a while. But these leading institutions, these banks, they're using automation in much more strategic ways now.
Okay.
They're applying it to the really high-risk areas. So, core banking systems, payment processing, things like that.
Okay. So that's where if something breaks, it's really bad.
Exactly. And they're also, they're automating the generation of compliance documentation, which can be, incredibly tedious to do manually.
I bet.
And they're even using AI to sort of help them prioritize which tests are the most important to run.
Oh, interesting. So how does that work? The AI part.
So basically, the AI can look at past test results, recent code changes, all that kind of stuff, and it can actually predict which areas of the software are most likely to have new bugs.
Wow.
So it's not about just automating everything. It's about being really smart about what to automate and then using more advanced tech to make the automation itself more effective.
Okay. So it's not just doing things faster, it's doing the right things faster.
Exactly.
And that's where AI comes in. Okay, cool. And what kind of results are they seeing from this more intelligent, strategic approach to automation?
The results can be pretty dramatic, actually. The Capgemini report from 2023, they found that companies with strong automation strategies were able to release new software about 4.5 times more frequently.
4.5 times.
Yeah, and with 70% fewer critical defects.
Wow, that is a game changer.
It is, both in terms of speed and the overall quality of what they're releasing.
Okay, so it sounds like this intelligent automation is really key to kind of beating that testing tax. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the human side of things. You mentioned this fourth dimension, cross-functional testing teams. How is that changing the way QA is done?
Yeah, so historically, QA teams have often been kind of siloed, right? They were separate from the development teams, the business people, everyone else.
Right.
But we're starting to see this real shift towards more collaboration.
Okay.
The World Quality Report, they said that 59% of banks are now embedding QA specialists directly within their development teams.
Okay, so they're right there in the trenches.
Exactly. And you're also seeing a lot more involvement from, like, compliance officers. 47% of banks said that compliance is more involved now.
Okay.
And even, like, the actual business users, the
Yeah.
people who will be using the software, 38% are more involved in testing now. So it's much more integrated.
Okay. So it's about bringing all these different perspectives together earlier in the process, right?
Mhm.
Instead of just having the testers come in at the very end and say, okay, let's see if this works.
Exactly. And I mean, the benefits of this increased collaboration, they're huge. The same report, the World Quality Report, they said that it's led to a 56% reduction in misunderstandings about what the software was supposed to do in the first place.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So you get everyone on the same page earlier on.
Right?
You build that shared understanding of what needs to be delivered and tested.
Yeah.
And that leads to fewer errors and less rework later down the line.
Makes total sense. And it's interesting is that like a lot of this is about just better organization and communication, which, when you think about these big, complex technical challenges, that's not always what comes to mind first,
Right.
but it's so important.
Absolutely.
Okay, so better communication, shared goals. That's huge. All right, so the fifth and final dimension, this is the metrics-driven quality culture.
Yes.
How are these leading companies, these institutions, changing the way they measure the success of their testing?
So the real shift here is moving away from just looking at how many tests you've run or how many defects you found.
Okay.
And instead focusing on the actual business outcomes, the actual value that the testing delivers.
Right.
So instead of just counting tests executed, they're looking at metrics like risks mitigated. How has this testing actually reduced the chance of something going wrong?
Okay.
They're measuring the time to verify a requirement to see how efficient they are, and they're directly tying what they call quality escapes, which were basically the bugs that sneak into the live system. They're tying those directly to things like customer satisfaction and, what's the potential business impact.
Okay, so it's about kind of demonstrating with real numbers the value that a strong QA function brings to the entire organization.
Exactly. It's about proving the ROI.
The ROI.
In terms that business leaders can understand and appreciate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so this whole evolution, it's really fascinating. And, the best part is you send over this really great real-world example of how all of these changes can play out in a real company.
Yeah.
So tell us about this regional bank that totally overhauled their testing.
Yeah, the 2023 ISTQB Worldwide Software Testing Practices Report. They have this really interesting case study about this regional bank that decided to really embrace a lot of these new ideas we've been talking about.
Yes.
And the results they saw were pretty impressive. Like their compliance documentation time went down by 40%.
40%.
Yeah, so that freed up a lot of resources, right? The release cycles got 30% faster. So they could get new things out to their customers way quicker.
Yeah.
Their overall test coverage improved by 45%.
Wow.
So they had a lot more confidence in the quality of their systems.
Yeah.
And maybe most importantly, they actually achieved a full ROI, a full return on their investment in all these new approaches within just 9 months.
Well, within 9 months.
Yeah.
So it's not even like, you have to wait years and years to see the benefits. It's
Right.
like you can start seeing real results relatively quickly. So faster releases, better test coverage, less time spent on paperwork, and a clear return on investment. I mean, that's a pretty powerful story.
It is. It really shows what's possible when you're willing to kind of, step outside the box a little bit and try some new things.
Yeah, embrace change. Okay, so big picture, looking ahead, where do you see QA and financial services going? Do you think this shift, this move towards these more modern practices is going to continue and become kind of the standard?
Yeah. I mean, all signs point to yes, right? IDC, they put out this report from their Financial Insights division, and they predicted that by 2025, something like 70% of financial institutions will have modernized their testing.
70%.
Yeah, as a core part of, their overall digital transformation. So yeah, that's a pretty big shift, and it's happening pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's huge. What about the companies that don't adapt, that decide to stick with the old ways of doing things, what's the risk for them?
Yeah, the sources you sent over, they're pretty clear about this.
Okay.
Organizations that stick with, those outdated, fragmented, mostly manual testing processes, they're probably going to have a really hard time keeping up
Yeah.
with, how fast technology is changing and with the ever-increasing demands of regulators.
Hmm.
So they risk falling behind their competitors, having more errors, more problems, more expensive problems, and, potentially even facing more scrutiny, more penalties from the regulators.
So the message is clear.
Hmm.
Adapt or get left behind.
Pretty much, yeah.
All right, so as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into quality assurance and financial services, I think the big takeaway is that this testing tax we talked about, right? It's real, it's costing these companies a lot,
Yeah.
and sticking with those old ways of doing things, it's not sustainable anymore.
Hmm.
So making that shift to a more strategic, more automated, more collaborative, and more metrics-driven approach, it's not just a nice thing to have, it's becoming absolutely essential.
I completely agree.
Yeah, the financial institutions that embrace change, that embrace these new ideas, are going to be in a much better position to deal with the challenges that are coming. They're going to be able to manage risk better,
Right.
and ultimately they're going to be able to deliver a better experience to their customers.
Exactly.
So as you've been listening to us today, thinking about all of this, thinking about the very real costs of that testing tax, what part of your own organization's approach to quality assurance do you think you need to reevaluate?
Good question.
What initial steps can you take to start moving toward the more effective, more modern testing strategy? That's the question we want to leave you with today. Because the landscape is changing fast, and the companies that adapt are going to be the ones that thrive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone, and we'll see you next time.